The two poems Western literature is built on were composed by a man who almost certainly could not write. Not wouldn't, couldn't. When those poems were taking shape, the Greek alphabet was either brand new or had not arrived yet, and the poems themselves show someone building lines out of ready-made parts, like a wall built from bricks somebody else fired. Now take any fact you are sure of about him: that he was blind, that he came from Chios, that 7 cities fought over his birthplace, that he died on a Greek island after failing to solve a children's riddle. Every one of those traces back to a poem describing itself, or a biography that fakes its own author and then contradicts him, or a legend antiquity seems to have invented so it could stop being asked a question it couldn't answer. There is no birth date. There is no death date. There is no document from anyone who met him. Nothing even claims to be one. Scholars have argued for 230 years about whether he was one man, several, or a job description. But this isn't a video about a blank space. It's the opposite. Because in 1935, in a Balkan town, a professor from Harvard put a recording machine in front of a butcher who could not read, and what came out of that man is the closest anyone has got to watching this work done. And what happened to the professor before the year was out is a story about how myths get built at the expense of the one man who had just explained it. Homer. He was born in Smyrna, or Chios, or Colophon, or Argos, or Athens, or Ithaca, or Rhodes, or Salamis, or Pylos. Ancient sources give all of those, and no 2 of the surviving lists match each other. 7 is the number people remember, and it got fixed by an 18th century English couplet that added a sting to it, that the wealthy towns fighting over the dead poet were the same towns he had begged in while he was alive. Look at what sits behind the claims. Smyrna had a grotto where he was supposed to have composed. Chios had something more solid. A guild of professional reciters who performed the poems for a living, and an obvious commercial interest in them belonging to Chios. Athens was pushed by Aristarchus, the greatest of the ancient editors. Smyrna and Chios are the strongest ancient claims, and neither is verifiable. Nobody in antiquity had a document. What they had was civic pride and competing traditions, and the lists grew rather than converged. So hold on to that question. Where was he from? Antiquity never answered it, and near the end of this you'll see the strange thing it did instead. Start with the name, because even that is contested. Homeros is an ordinary Greek word, and it means a hostage or a pledge, a person handed over as security. That is the popular proposal. There is a second. It reads the word as a compound, built from the piece meaning together and a verb meaning to fit or to join. On that reading, the name means something like the one who fits it together. A description of the job, not a person. And there is a third, which is the uncomfortable one. The reciters on Chios called themselves the Homeridae. A name like that usually points back to a founder. But some scholars argue it runs the other way round, that the guild came first and invented an ancestor afterwards to explain its own name. On that reading, the poet is a back formation, a story a professional body told about itself. One summary of the etymology states flatly that the word does not seem to have emerged from any root meaning pledge or security, which knocks out the popular version, and the dictionaries hedge by saying the name has also been otherwise explained. 3 live proposals, mutually exclusive, no consensus. We cannot say what he was called, or whether it was a name at all rather than a description of what he did. The blindness is the detail everybody has. The blind poet, the sightless singer, carved that way for 2,500 years. It comes from one line. One line inside a poem called the Homeric Hymn to Apollo, where the poet stops, addresses the girls of Delos, and asks them to remember him. He describes himself in the third person.
He is a blind man, and dwells in rocky Chios. His lays are evermore supreme.
That translation is Hugh Evelyn White from 1914, and that single sentence is the entire foundation. Thucydides cited it as evidence. Every later biography is built on top of it. There are 2 problems with treating it as fact. The first is that the hymn to Apollo is not the Iliad, and it is not the Odyssey, and its authorship is disputed, so calling this a self-portrait is already a legend rather than a record. Some scholars attribute the hymn to a particular reciter from Chios called Cynethus, whose likely dates are far too late for him to be the poet anybody means. The second problem is what the line is actually doing. Modern scholars read it as advertising instead of autobiography. A blind singer living on Chios is precisely the ancestor the Chian Guild needed, and the poem is telling its audience who to remember and where he lived. Whether he was blind is unknown and probably unknowable. What's certain is that the tradition wanted him blind and got its wish for 25 centuries. 10 ancient biographies of him survive as a genre. The longest and most detailed of them is a forgery, and it gives itself away in its own arithmetic. It opens by announcing that Herodotus of Halicarnassus wrote it. He didn't. Scholars have rejected the attribution since before printing existed, and modern estimates put the real text somewhere between the 2nd and the 4th century AD, written for an audience that enjoyed a good literary pastiche. But here is the part that finishes it off. The forged life dates the birth by counting 168 years after the fall of Troy, 622 years before the Persian invasion. That lands it around 1102 BC. The real Herodotus, in a book we actually have, says the poet lived not more than 400 years before his own time. That is somewhere around 850 BC. The fake and the man it is impersonating are 250 years apart on the most basic fact in the book. And that fake is where the biography you half know comes from. It gives him a birth name, Melesigenes. It makes him the illegitimate son of a woman called Cretheus. It gives him an eye disease that worsens on a voyage back from Ithaca until he goes blind at Colophon, and only then, with nothing else left, does he take up poetry to earn a living. It is a good story. It is also somebody's fiction, written perhaps 1,000 years after the poems, so set the biography aside and look at what does exist, which is 2 poems. The Iliad runs to 15,693 lines across 24 books, and even that figure carries a caveat, because the standard count traces back to a scholar who never clearly explained how he had counted, and individual lines are still argued over from edition to edition. The Odyssey runs to 12,019. The Iliad covers a few weeks of a 10-year war, and it opens like this.
Sing, O goddess, the anger of Achilles son of Peleus, that brought countless ills upon the Achaeans.
The Odyssey is a homecoming that takes 10 years, and it opens the same way.
Tell me, O Muse, of that ingenious hero who travelled far and wide after he had sacked the famous town of Troy.
Both of those are Samuel Butler's prose translations from the 1890s, and notice what the poet is doing in each one. He isn't announcing, he's asking. He is requesting the song from a goddess, which is not a figure of speech, a man sitting down to write a book reaches for first. Which poem came first is unresolved, and the honest position is the one the sources take. The arguments exist for either, and it is not clear. Both are usually dated to the 8th or 7th century BC, and every part of that sentence is contested too. Now, the problem that runs underneath all of it. The Greek alphabet, borrowed and adapted from the Phoenicians, reached Greece in the 9th or the early 8th century BC. It was the first alphabetic system anywhere to write vowels down. The dates collide. Writing arrives in Greece at roughly the same moment these poems are taking their shape, and the best evidence puts the poems on the wrong side of it. Sit with the size of that. The Iliad is longer than most novels. It is in strict meter, every line of it. And on the evidence, it was made by people with no practical way of writing anything down, in a society that had lost the writing system its own ancestors used. So the question stops being, who was he, and becomes something harder. How do you compose 15,000 metrical lines without a pen? Not memorize, compose. For 2,000 years, nobody had a serious answer, and the assumption was the natural one, that a great poet wrote a great poem and the mechanics were not interesting. Then, a German scholar asked whether any of that was true. And if none of it was written down, here is one more question worth planting. Is there anything physical, anything you could put in a museum case, that touches these poems near the time they were made? Hold that one. For a century and a half, the answer came out of Germany. Friedrich August Wolff published the Prolegomena ad Homerum in 1795, and it is the book that opened the whole modern argument. Wolff's case was that writing was unknown to the poet, and that poems this long could not have been composed in the form we have them without it. What we are reading, he argued, is not one work. It is a set of shorter songs, made separately and sung separately, and assembled into 2 long poems centuries later, possibly under the Athenian tyrant Pisistratus. That last part has not held up, There is little evidence for a Pisistratian edition. Most present-day scholars doubt it happened, and the tradition has been under attack since 1846. But the main argument split classical scholarship in two for the next century. The analysts followed Wolff and pulled the poems apart looking for the seams. Karl Lachmann took the Iliad and announced it was 16 independent lays with enlargements and interpolations over them. The Unitarians pushed back, arguing that whatever the raw material was, the design of each poem is single-minded enough that one artist must have shaped it. Both sides had good arguments. Neither could settle it, because both were doing the same thing, reading closely and inferring what must have happened behind the text. The argument ran for over a century on internal evidence alone. What ended the stalemate was not a new reading of the poems. It was a young American who decided the question was not a literary one at all. Milman Parry, an American, submitted 2 doctoral theses at the Sorbonne in 1928. One on the traditional epithet in the poems, one on formulae and meter. He was in his 20s. What Parry noticed was the phrasing. Swift-footed Achilles, the wine-dark sea, rosy-fingered dawn. Everybody had noticed those. What nobody had done was count them, measure them, and ask what shape they were. A formula, in Parry's definition, is a group of words regularly used under the same metrical conditions to express a given essential idea. The system those formulas make has 2 properties a writer would never produce. The first is scope. There is a formula ready for almost every idea the poems need, sized to fit the gaps in the line. The second is economy, and it is the one that closes the case. For any given idea, at any given length, there is normally exactly one formula available. No alternatives. No variety. The same phrase for Odysseus, answering a question, turns up around 100 times. A literate poet does the opposite. Virgil varies the same idea constantly, because a man with a page in front of him can improve on his last attempt and will. This system is not built for improving. It is built for speed, under pressure, out loud, with no time to think, by somebody assembling a line out of parts he already has in his hands. Parry had described how the poems were made. What he had not done was watch it happen, so in 1933 he went to Yugoslavia to find somebody still doing it. The reasoning was blunt. If the epics had been composed in performance by singers who could not read, then anywhere in a literate epic tradition was still running, the same machinery ought to be visible in the open. In the mountains of what is now Bosnia, Montenegro and Serbia, it was. Singers called guslari performed long heroic songs on a one-stringed fiddle called the gusle, and most of them could not read a word. Parry took a graduate assistant, Albert Bates Lord, and the two worked mainly out of Dubrovnik through 1934 and 1935. Parry learned Serbo-Croatian so he could talk to the singers directly rather than through anybody else. And then he recorded them. More than 12,000 texts. Around 3,500 recordings cut onto 12-inch aluminium discs on equipment that had to be hauled into villages. That collection still exists. It is at Harvard, in Widener Library, under his name. And inside it there is one singer who settles the argument better than any reading of the poems ever could. His name was Avdo Medjedovic. He worked as a butcher, and he was illiterate his whole life. The man who kept the shop next to his had bought a cheap printed songbook in Sarajevo with a story in it called The Wedding of Smilagic Meho. That man could read, slowly, and he made the text out and read it aloud to him. That was the entire extent of his access to it. He could not check a line, and he could not go back and reread one. Then he gave it back. Over 8 days in July 1935, he dictated it aloud to a scribe, and the text they took down runs to 12,311 lines. Set that against the Odyssey, which runs to 12,009. A butcher who could not read, in a small Balkan town in the 1930s, produced a poem longer than the Odyssey, in meter, out loud. And his version was not a recitation of the printed one. It diverged from it heavily, and it was far more descriptive than the source, which is exactly the point. He was not remembering. He was composing, live, out of the same kind of inherited machinery Parry had reconstructed from the Greek. That is the closest anyone has ever come to standing in the room while this work is done. Not a theory about a poet. A man doing the thing out loud, with someone writing it down as he went. and the man who recorded him was dead before the end of that year. Milman Parry's end is short, and it was told wrong for most of a century. On the 3rd of December 1935, he was in a hotel on South Alvarado Street in Los Angeles, unpacking a suitcase. A revolver was in among the clothing. He had carried it in Yugoslavia, where the fieldwork took him into places he'd been warned about. It went off. It went off. The shot went into his chest. His wife Marion was in the next room, heard it, came through and called an ambulance, and he died there. Los Angeles detectives investigated. The county coroner, Frank Nance, ruled it an accident, and on the death certificate the words suicide and homicide are struck out. The newspapers reported an accident too. And then the rumors started, and it lasted decades. The story in classics departments was that he had killed himself, despondent at being refused a permanent post at Harvard. In 2019, the classicist Steve Reese went through the documents properly: the coroner's report, the police record, the press, the personnel decisions. Parry had just been reappointed that same summer to a second 3-year term as assistant professor. There is no evidence he would not have been promoted. Reese's conclusion, based on contemporary documents, is that there appears to have been nothing mysterious or sensational or heroic about it. Read that again with the rest of this video in your hand. The man who worked out how a tradition builds a story around a figure, by going and watching one do it, had a story built around him by professional scholars, and it took 84 years for anyone to check the paperwork. Albert Lord finished the work. He went back to the same region in the 1950s, added his own fieldwork to what the two of them had gathered, and published The Singer of Tales in 1960. It is the book that turned oral composition from a claim about 2 Greek poems into a general theory with evidence under it, and it has since been applied to Old English verse and to traditions with no connection to Greece at all. But be careful about what it proves. Parry and Lord established that the epics were composed orally, inside a living tradition, using an inherited system. That demolishes the strongest analyst position, the idea of a patchwork stitched together by later editors, because a single oral poet can produce a poem that long, and we have one on disc. What it does not do is prove there was one man behind the name. An oral tradition can throw up a dominant, brilliant final shaper. It can also throw up several. Most classicists today lean toward a single dominant poet for each poem, working inside the tradition. Lean, though, not conclude. The evidence fits both, and the field has been honest about saying so. So we have explained the how. The who is still wide open. Here is the museum case. I asked you to hold a question about physical evidence, and this is the answer. There is remarkably little of it. On the island of Ischia, off the Italian coast, there was an early Greek trading settlement called Pithecusae. In 1954, an archaeologist called Giorgio Buchner opened Tomb 68 in its cemetery and found a clay drinking cup. It was made around 735 to 720 BC and buried a decade or so later, and it carries 3 scratched lines of writing, which makes it one of the oldest surviving pieces of writing in the Greek alphabet anywhere in the world. The lines are in verse, and they say this: I am the cup of Nestor, good for drinking. Whoever drinks from this cup, desire for beautifully crowned Aphrodite will seize him instantly. Nestor is a character in the Iliad whose cup the poem describes as so enormous an ordinary man could barely lift it. This is a small clay cup on a trading island a long way west of Greece, making a joke at the expense of a poem in meter in the 8th century BC. If the joke is what it looks like, the story was already circulating by around 730 BC, inside the traditional window for the poems being made. But the first line has a hole in it. At least 15 reconstructions have been proposed, and they change whether the cup is claiming to be the famous one or laughing at the comparison. It is the best physical link we have. It is also an inscription with a gap in the middle. What about the war? There is a hill in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik, dug at intervals since the 1870s, holding a stack of cities one on top of another. Troy 6 was large, fortified and wealthy, and seems to have come down in an earthquake rather than a war. Troy 7a was built onto its ruins and burned around 1180 BC, with bronze arrowheads and sling stones in the debris, which looks like fighting. If there is a historical event under the Iliad, that burned layer is the majority pick, and a vocal minority still argues for the earlier layer. Manfred Kaufmann dug there from 1988 to 2005 and argued it was far bigger than anyone thought, a trading hub with a lower city outside the citadel, 15 times the expected size. That went very badly. In 2001, the historian Frank Kolb publicly accused him of misrepresenting his own findings. A conference in 2002 and more digging in 2003 went broadly Kaufman's way. Kolb never conceded. Then there are the Hittite records. A place called Wilusa, lining up with Wilios, the older form of Ilios. A people called the Ahiawa, lining up with the Achaeans, the Iliad's word for the Greeks. And a treaty with a king of Wilusa named Alexandru, lining up with Alexandros, the Iliad's other name for Paris. Those identifications are generally accepted and also explicitly described as not firmly established, which is a careful sentence doing a lot of work. They do not give you a siege, a stolen queen, or a 10-year war, and the specialists warn loudest that thin evidence bends to whatever conclusion you want. Two modern attempts to pin the date down, and in both the criticism is better than the claim. In 2008, a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences argued that a passage in the Odyssey, where a seer sees darkness fall at midday, records a real solar eclipse. The authors added 3 more details. Venus low before dawn, 2 constellations visible together, a new moon. Then a reading of a god's journey as the planet Mercury. Then they searched all 1,684 new moons between 1250 and 1115 BC for one date that fitted all of it. They got one. The 16th of April, 1178 BC, a total eclipse whose path crossed the Ionian Islands. Then Peter Gainsford took it apart in 2012. The passage does not have to describe an eclipse at all. 4 indicators converging can be coincidence rather than code. And no Greek poet is known to have used a god's movements to encode a planet's, which removes one of the 4 legs the argument stands on. In 2013, a different team ran Bayesian statistics over vocabulary, comparing Homeric Greek with Hittite and modern Greek, and produced a date of 727 BC. Their own 95% range was 1351 BC to 61 BC. That is a window 14 centuries wide. They said outright their model used no historical, cultural, or archaeological information, and could not say whether they were dating composition or the writing down. A historian of science pointed at the deeper problem, that the poems were carried orally for centuries and imitated for centuries more, so which moment is being measured is unclear. Both papers made headlines. Neither survived contact with the specialists. Long before any of that, the ancient world was having its own version of this argument, and it happened in a library. Herodotus of Ephesus ran the Library of Alexandria and produced the first known critical edition of the poems around 280 BC. He marked lines he thought were fake with a short horizontal dash in the margin, and he may be the man who divided each poem into 24 books. Aristophanes of Byzantium, his pupil, added a second symbol, a small star, for passages that did not make sense. Then, Aristarchus of Samothrace, in the 2nd century BC, produced the edition that mattered most. His principle was to explain the poems out of the poems themselves. He judged every doubtful line against the rest of the text rather than against his own taste. And when he thought a line was spurious, he did not delete it. He left it standing with a mark against it so a reader could see the doubt and disagree. That is a better editorial standard than a lot of what came after. He needed it because he had opponents. There was a group of ancient scholars called the Chorizontes, the separators, who argued the Iliad and the Odyssey were the work of 2 different poets. 2 names survive, Zenon and Hellanicus, and beyond the names nothing is known about either man. Aristarchus wrote a polemic against them, one aimed directly at Zenon. So the question of whether one person made both poems is not a modern invention. It was an argument between professionals 2,000 years ago, and their books are lost too. So how did any of it reach us? In fragments, mostly, and partly by accident. Copies on papyrus keep surfacing from Egypt, some pulled out of mummy wrappings, dating anywhere from the 3rd century BC to the 7th century AD. One count put the total number of surviving Iliad witnesses, papyri and later manuscripts together at around 1800, and noted that the inventory is incomplete, with new pieces still turning up. For the Odyssey, the papyri are far fewer, in the order of dozens. The oldest complete Iliad in existence is a vellum book made at the end of the 10th century AD, known as Venetus A. A typical page carries 25 lines of the poem surrounded by up to 5 separate sets of marginal notes, and some preserve the critical marks and commentary out of Alexandria, 1,000 years older than the book they sit in. Cardinal Bessarion bought it in the 15th century and gave it to Venice with the rest of his Greek collection, and it is still there. In 2007, a project photographed and 3D scanned every page and released the images under a Creative Commons license. And the first printed edition came out in Florence on the 9th of December 1488, edited by a Byzantine Greek scholar called Demetrius Chalcondyles. It was the first major work of Greek literature ever printed in its own language. Between the poem being made and the oldest complete copy anybody owns, there is a gap of roughly 1800 years. The death is a legend, and it should be told as one. The story sits in a text called The Contest, which stages a poetry competition between the two great early Greek poets, and it is echoed by Pausanias, by Proclus, and by the Byzantine scholar Tzetzes. In it, he goes to the oracle at Delphi to ask where he came from, which tells you exactly what antiquity thought the unanswerable question was. The oracle tells him his mother's home is the island of Chios, that Chios will welcome him when he dies, and that he should beware the riddle of the young children. He goes anyway. On the shore at Chios he finds boys fishing, asks them what they have caught, and they answer him with a riddle. What we caught we left behind, and what we did not catch we carry with us. It is lice. They mean lice, the ones they picked off themselves and threw away against the ones they missed. The greatest poet in the world, expecting an answer about fish, cannot solve it, and he goes off so dejected that he slips in the mud and dies. The riddle was circulating very early. Heraclitus knew it around 500 BC, and one scholarly reading of the whole legend is the sharpest thing in this story. Delphi was a storehouse of riddles, and this one may have been a graceful way of changing the subject, away from the single question about him that nobody could answer. Where was he from? He gets a death on Chios instead of a birthplace anywhere, so here is where that leaves us. No birth date and no death date. No birthplace two ancient sources agree on. No document from anybody who met him, because nobody ever claimed to have. The blindness is one line in a poem of disputed authorship. The fullest biography is a forgery that contradicts the historian whose name it borrowed. The death is a folk tale that may have existed to dodge a question. Even the name might not be a name. And none of that is a hole where the truth should be. It is the answer. Because of a professor with a recording machine and a butcher who could not read, we know what these poems are. They are the output of a system, worked out over generations, carried in living memory, performed and rebuilt every time, until at some point somebody, one person or several, gave two of them the shape they have held ever since. Whether that person had a name, and whether the name was his, is a smaller question than it looks. He did not write the Iliad in the sense you mean when you say somebody wrote a book. Nobody did. That is not a disappointment. It is a stranger and better fact. And there is a reason to keep saying it out loud. A blind man of Chios, 7 cities, a riddle on a beach, those got repeated for 2,500 years because a good story travels and a caveat doesn't. It happened to a Harvard professor in 1935 too. So here is my question for the comments. What is the one thing you were certain of about him before this? Name it, and I will tell you where it came from.